relates.
Everybody stop shooting. Everybody stop shooting. Everybody stop shooting. Everybody stop shooting.
Welcome to Neighbors in the Crossfire. I'm Christopher Norris, the community contributors and engagement editor here at WHYY. It's no secret that gun violence often occurs in neighborhoods where there isn't just poverty, but also poor education, a prevalence of illegal guns and drugs, and few job opportunities, which ultimately result in a lack of hope. These are the makings of a disadvantaged community, and that is what we're going to talk about on this episode.
We often talk about what gun violence takes. Let's talk about what gun violence leaves behind. The broken communities, the broken families, the broken bodies, the trauma, the children who see the dead bodies in their streets and have to go to school. And we don't address their trauma. Hurt people hurt people. We need to be talking about the social determinants that lead to gun violence, the poverty, the housing scarcity, the food desert, lack of jobs, lack of resources, lack of concern for the black lives and the blood that's running through the streets of Philadelphia.
Joining me in conversation is the Reverend Gregory Holston, Special Advisor on Policy and Advocacy at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, Jawan Z. Bennett, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at Temple University, and Movita Johnson-Harrell, founder of the Charles Foundation, who you watched in the opening clip. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Let's start here. In January of 2019, the city of Philadelphia released its roadmap to safer communities. And one of the key recommendations is, quote, to promote community health and well-being by prioritizing the reduction of structural violence through unpacking and addressing the physical and programmatic inequalities that exist in communities at the highest rate of violence. As you guys see it, and I'll start with you, Movita, what are the physical and programmatic inequalities that make up a disadvantaged community? And are we as a city addressing it with enough urgency?
So thank you for having me on, Chris, and thank you for the great question. We are not addressing the issues that affect communities most affected by gun violence. We know nationally 17,000 children and teens are killed by homicide a year. Firearm is the leading cause of death for Black males. 20 to 24-year-olds are more likely to be killed. They make up 7% of the population, but over 23% of the homicides, and 95% of those are males. We know that through studying this issue, because we know homicide is a public health crisis, right? It's an epidemic. We know through studying this epidemic so far that there are social determinants that specifically lead to gun violence. Mm-hmm. Someone sent me a question this morning and asked me, it was a white female friend of mine, and she said, I wore a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, and somebody asked me, why do Black people kill Black people? And what I explained to her was that white people kill white people. Violence happens inter-community, right? But why it's so much more concentrated in communities of color is because of systemic institutional racism. It's because of poverty. It's because there's a lack of jobs. It's because there's a lack of education, a lack of resources. So if we were to inundate these communities with what they needed to be successful, then the gun violence would decrease.
Jawan, same question to you. What are the physical and programmatic inequalities that make up a disadvantaged community? And are we as a city addressing it with enough urgency?
Chris, my mother will always say, show me your friends and I'll show you who you are. I think we could take the same adage of vintage, show me your communities and we can show you where your crime are. And I think to Movita's point, when we introduced the clip, criminologists have often talked about these particular notions, right? So there's an age-old debate in criminology. Is it the kinds of places or is it the kinds of people when we think about crime? So a lot of them talk about it's the kinds of places. And so if you have schools that are rampant with educational failure, if you have environments that are plagued with food deserts, when you have extreme poverty, William Julius Wilson talks about in his book, In the Truly Disadvantaged, when people don't have key access to resources, then there's no surprise when we should see crime crime spurring up in these particular places. And with a lot of the criminologists from the Chicago school, which came around this place-based notion of justice by geography, is notion that there are certain types of things that happen in communities which we can look to crime. And I don't think that we're solving this issue as fast as we can. A lot of people talk about COVID-19 and there's been a pandemic, but I would like to argue that we've been in the pandemic for 400 years. And one of the things that we have to be cognizant about is Todd Clare talks about this idea of community justice. And for our leaders, our politicians, our state makers, our legislators, he coins this term community justice, which means that giving community members the decision-making ability, but also realizing that quality of life issue as an explicit goal. So Todd Clare talks about the heart of community justice is to make sure the places where people live, eat, and raise their families are good places to do so.
Got it. Reverend Holston?
I think it's very clear that that question deals with all of the institutions, because we live in a society that's systemically racist. So we're talking about 400 years of systemic racism. We're talking about basically 60 years of major disinvestment in Black communities in Philadelphia. Philadelphia once was known as the manufacturer to the world. It used to build airplanes, used to build military equipment, used to build cars. Many old buildings there are along Lehigh Valley, Lehigh Avenue, were buildings that were manufacturing plants that sent things all over the world. And when Black people came into those communities, those jobs and those businesses first went to the suburbs, then they went to the South, then they went overseas, and now many of them have automated away. And they have never been replaced. There's never been the industry replaced in those communities. And now we see gun violence, and we wonder why it is. Why now we see poverty rates in those same areas in Philadelphia, and some are close to 50% poverty rate, 50% unemployment rate. How could we not expect, when that level of disinvestment has occurred, that people will not respond in somewhat of a violent fashion? In every other area where that has happened, whether it's Black or white, places like Johnstown, Pennsylvania, when it lost all the steel mills, it had the same kind of response. Violence went up, pain went up, alcoholism went up, drug addiction went up. All of the same things happened because of the lack of investment in those communities. Black communities are no different. And so have we been addressing it? No, not really, not at all. Our government, our federal government should have been long ago, was asked in the 80s, in the 90s, to put together what was called a Marshall Plan, like we've done for countries of Germany and Japan after the end of the war, where we would put major investment in those areas to rebuild those areas for the next century. And we have never done it. We have never made the steps forward to make that happen, either on a state level or a city level as well. And so, of course, we have not really addressed the social determinants.
Let me bring Movita back into the conversation. I saw you nod in approval. You know, I had a conversation earlier and someone said the term, what we're seeing in this violence is really the chickens coming home to roost. You would agree with that?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that, Chris, because when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, every human being needs specific things in order to thrive in this world. They need safety and security. They need love and belonging. They need food. And that's how they reach self-actualization, right? We have not been providing that to the Black community for 400 years. And when we talk about, and I want to thank the Reverend for what he said, because when we talk about divestment, we can't talk about divestment without looking at criminal justice, right? Because we went from slavery to mass incarceration. You know, when they declared a war on drugs, it was literally a war on Black folk, right? And they started throwing people in jail for small amounts of drugs. And then we had the prison industrial complex that the business boomed. And now you can actually buy stock in prisons. So it is all intentional. But I think it's intentional by design, but I think it's a problem that we can fix. What we need is for the people who are the leaders to be committed to fixing this problem, to make sure that we are investing in communities of color, that we are investing in those most likely to cause harm to others. You know, we look at these children because a lot of these people who are carrying guns are children. They're causing havoc, right? We look at these children and we blame them for the problem when they are not the blame for the problem. We as a society are to blame for the problem because we deprive them of the basic fundamentals that they need to be successful in life. And then we give them guns. We give them easy accessibility to guns. They can get a gun faster than they can get a job. So the situation, you create a certain situation, you're going to get a certain outcome. And as the Reverend said, the chickens have come home to roost.
Let me get all of your reaction on this. The city council member, Jamie Gauthier, recently wrote a letter to the mayor. It's gotten some attention recently, where she's asked him to declare gun violence a citywide emergency, which in effect would allow the 30-plus departments to communicate, to work together, to come up with a response. Is it shocking to you that since violence has been increasing since 2014, we're already at a mark of over 300 people killed in the city of Philadelphia, that we're just trying to get it declared an emergency and that we're just trying to get a coordinated response? Jawan, I'll start with you, then Reverend Movita.
Chris, I think that's particularly interesting. I think a lot of times this is why the phrase Black Lives Matters has been coming, especially in the roots, to say that we've been in a candid situation. I think that when we think about gun violence, and I think the COVID-19, as people talk about year of 2020, has let us see things clearly. And what has really said it clearly is those issues that we've been talking about in our community for years. My parents have lost people to gun violence. I've lost my friend to gun violence, which I wrote in my personal statement when I got into the doctoral program. My sister has just lost some friends recently to gun violence with the incidents that happened last night in South Philadelphia. So I think what becomes really interesting is that we have to really be intentional about changing opportunity structures, incorporating racial justice, and really focus on those social economic inequalities. So I think it's reached a critical mass now, and that we see that amidst the pandemic, there's also another pandemic that's been plaguing the Black community. If we don't do something quick, we don't know what's going to happen soon.
Reverend Holston, I'm sure that you would say that we've already been at an emergency level.
Absolutely. First of all, I'm really excited about Councilwoman Gauthier's leadership on so many issues. But I think she actually has this wrong. The public health, no, she's right to make the decision that we should do that. And she just doesn't realize that 2 years ago, the Public Health Department of Philadelphia said this was that the gun violence was an emergency. And so it was said 2 years ago, it was declared 2 years ago. It is just the lack of inactivity to really treat it like an emergency is making people think you never declared it in the first place, which is ridiculous. And so we make these statements, we make these pronouncements. It's an emergency 2 years ago. Last year we had emergency sessions on this. Council came in. I testified at those emergency sessions. I said what we need to do. Nothing was done. The mayor at the beginning of this year put it in his address that gun violence was going to be the #1 thing. Well, it still has not been addressed. So we continue to make these statements, and without the real resources being put together to be put behind the plans that are already have been put out there, then we sitting around looking around and wondering why there's so many murders going on in our city. There has been a leadership in some ways that knows how to say things, but the follow through, it just has not been there.
Movita?
I agree with Jawan and Reverend Holstein, and I commend Councilperson Jamie Gauthier for her efforts, but we've been in a state of emergency. In 2019, September 2nd, we had 232 homicides. We are 2020, and we now have 306 homicides. We are up 32%. We are about to match, if not extend beyond 2007, where we had 391 homicides. Every year in Philadelphia, we have hearings on gun violence.
Well, now to your point, Movita, we're seeing more homicides in Philadelphia than in New York, which is a city that's 5 times our size.
Absolutely. And here's the thing, we've been steadily increasing. I'm a 4-time co-victim of homicide. March 30th, 1975, my father was murdered in front of my family. I was 8 years old. July 1st, 1991, my only brother was killed over a girl while his 5-year-old son sat in his lap. January 13th, 2011, my 18-year-old son, Charles Andre Johnson, was murdered in a case of mistaken identity. January 1st, 2013, my 24-year-old cousin, Stephen Kyrie Johnson, who was about to graduate Temple Fox School of Business, was murdered at a New Year's party being a peacemaker. I am not unique. My family is not unique in Philadelphia to this issue. People have multiple homicides in their family. But here's the problem, and this is why this has been my fight for so many years, because there's so much trauma, unaddressed trauma in our community. We could keep putting Band-Aids, we keep throwing dollars at things that we know that don't work. We need evidence-based practices. We need solutions. We need to stop, putting out these letters. We need to do the real work to save our communities. Before you know it, everybody in the city of Philadelphia is going to be touched by gun violence.
To that point, Reverend, I'd like to get you to weigh in on here, and Reverend Holston, then you can respond any way you like too. But, to Movita's point, in a crisis mode like this, we tend to just want action, even if it's not the right action. In some neighborhoods, they're asking for 24-hour police surveillance, which is, juxtaposed to the conversation about defunding the police is a quite interesting. But I can imagine that we've already been investing more and more into police over the last 5 years, and we've seen crime explode. A 24-hour police state in neighborhoods that are besieged by gun violence, that can't be the answer too, is it?
It cannot be the answer. It is absolutely the wrong answer, even though I understand completely why they're asking. We tried that in the 90s. We had, about 5 or 7 years, we had over 400 murders in the early 90s and in the mid 90s. And what we decided was to lock everybody up. We passed a crime bill nationally to increase number of police, to increase the number of prisons. And mass incarceration exploded, and we grew up to 2.2 million people incarcerated. And guess what we did? We only incarcerated the very fathers of the children that are shooting on the street right now.
Yes.
And they are having, some of those children have a colder heart than we have experienced before. And we're wondering why. Well, you took their father from them. You took many of their fathers who really weren't even in any type of serious crime. But because we were so harsh and so much punishment, we ended up affecting an entire generation that we're now dealing with. And when people say that chickens coming home to roost, that's what they mean. That means we made some mistakes before in this process, and now we're reaping the whirlwind of that. And now we want to turn around and make the same mistakes again. No, we need to reach out and use the evidence-based techniques that work, cure violence in this city, in the areas that has worked on in the 2014 and 2015, reduce the homicide rates in those areas by 30%. It works. It's working in all places across the country. But still, even though we have had that evidence, have we expanded that to every area in the city? Have we put the resources in to spend the 10 to 15 to 12 million dollars that you need to spend to expand that program across the city? No, we have not done it.
And why do you think we haven't done it yet? Juwan.
M-O-N-E-Y. We don't want to spend the dollars.
Would you agree, Juwan? Is it all about the dollar bill?
I think, from a criminal justice standpoint, I would agree with the Rev. I think one of the issues that we have was a lot of scholars talk about that criminal justice institutions and the system itself has become a total agency. And so what we saw even with schools was zero tolerance in the 90s with this whole super predator debate. And even when you go into hospitals and different type of places, you have metal detectors, you have school resources office, criminal justice has seeped into almost every aspect. And what we saw was we get something called the Marchison report in the 70s, where he basically calls that nothing works and that rehabilitation is not the way to go. And so we get this tough on crime mantra. And so everywhere we see in every aspect and every dimension of our society, we have this kind of hard, visceral response to individuals. And I think now we're at a critical mass where no matter how many police, if you have them 24/7, no matter how good the police are, no matter how good the data are, they will never be omnipresent. They can't solve all the crime. And a lot of scholars have talked about that crime was actually at its lowest when there were community organizations, churches, local nonprofits who were responsible for crime control. And if we're ever going to get to, and I think if we're ever going to get to a place where we see lower crime rates, is that we have to effectively have money and resources to give those organizations organizations who are on the ground the capacity, the staff, and the resources to do the jobs that we are. I mean, I'm a part of the Black clergy as well, and I know a lot of my other fellow brother pastors who are in the community, even the Islamic faith as well, who are out in the streets. We just don't have the capacity. I have a certain amount of membership and leadership at my church, and they do as well. We try to combine our resources. But when we talk about structural racism, what we're talking about, the idea is that in order to turn the tides, we're talking about 400 years ago, we're going to need significant amount of resources to begin to talk about that conversation.
Movita, I want to get you to weigh in. You know, I'm going to kind of go back to what Joanne said about the police. No matter how many police you bring into a community, I mean, I've read many reports, and I even had conversations with Joanne offline where, you know, data says that police don't prevent crime, they respond to it. You know, in Philly, most recently, we saw in late August, a 33-year-old man was shot and killed in Strawberry Mansion while he was talking to a police officer. You know, what does that say to you about both the brazenness of these criminals and maybe the lack of impact that police can have as a deterrence to crime?
So one thing that's really important that we take into consideration is the relationship between the police and the community in general, right? Because that relationship has always been very strenuous and tense. Most communities of color do not trust the police. That's number one. And right now, the police are just as much as at risk of getting shot as anybody else. When we talk about the disparities between communities, and we wonder why the problem is so that we're not addressing the problem in communities of color, because we cannot arrest our way out of this. That is not the solution. The police are not the solution to this. Social services and community engagement is the solution to this problem. When we talk about the disparity between communities of color and other communities and why our issues aren't being addressed. If you look at, let's take, for instance, the opioid epidemic, right? Let's look at the crack epidemic. Let's compare the opioid epidemic to the crack epidemic. Well, when it was Black folks, they were being locked up for using drugs. And now that it looks like other folks, we're throwing money at it by the truckloads. Some of that money we need to be throwing at gun violence. We need to stop criminalizing the victims. We have this situation in communities of color where we're always blaming the victim for the problems that they incur. The problems that are incurred, this problem with gun violence is not a problem created by communities of color. We do not make Smith and Wesson in the hood. Right? So where are the guns coming from? Why can't we get the money to be able to make sure people get mental health treatment, drug and alcohol treatment? Why can't we make sure people have jobs? Why can't we make sure that they get good education in a city where we have 13 council people of color? Right? So it's really important that we look at the whole picture. We cannot arrest our way out of this situation, and we cannot keep blaming the victims for what's happening in their communities when we're creating this situation as a society.
Reverend Holston, where are these guns coming from? I feel like that's a conversation we don't have enough.
And I appreciate the conversation. No one should be having this amount of guns on the street. Our young people shouldn't have this easy access to guns. Yes, we need to pass common sense gun legislation nationally and statewide. Yes, we need to do all those things. But I would tell you, and this goes along with what Movita says, there are just as many guns in the suburbs, in the homes of people. Why don't we hear so much about people shooting each other? Well, it doesn't happen as much because they have so many resources and so many other opportunities to live their lives in a positive way. They don't resort to the gun that they can pull right out of the dad's closet and shoot somebody with, like they could do the gun that they can pick up in the neighborhood where we live in. And so it is still about resources. It's still about that even though we don't want this easy access to guns and we need to pass the laws, more importantly, we need to do the things necessary to provide the opportunities for our people in our community. And let me say one last thing. There is a major difference between prevention and deterrence.
Yes.
Prevention is addressing the underlying reasons for gun violence, the poverty, the lack of resources, and the quality of schools, all of that. And deterrence is really just using punishment to try to get people to stop doing a crime. Deterrence does not have as strong or as positive effect as prevention work. But yet we spend almost $1 billion on law enforcement to basically what they do is deterrence. And it's not as effective. And then we get mad at the police officers and mad at the DA for, and you're not preventing crime. Well, we didn't design it to prevent crime. We designed it to deter crime. We need to now spend resources in the right place to prevent crime if we really want to get our handles on this problem, which ties right into the whole defund movement about using our resources in the right way.
Amen. Reverend Juwan, I want to bring you in.
Yes, I want to respond to that, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring in Elijah Anderson works, who talks about Code of the Street. And Elijah Anderson does his study in Philadelphia on Germantown Avenue, and he does an ethnography and observation, and he starts in the Germantown Avenue section and works his way all the way up to Chestnut Hill, and he talks about what's the difference? Why don't we see more crime in the Germantown section and you don't see those same crimes when you get to Chestnut Hill? And he talks about this idea of that when you're in Philadelphia context in Germantown, that when people don't have opportunities and when people don't have access to call the police and all these other resources, then people have to live by a street code. And when people live by a street code, there's a lot of different rules, as we know, coming up in Philadelphia. But the primarily rule is that violence is key. And so if it's not guns, it's going to be fighting, it's going to be stabbings. And so basically what he says, when you have an area that doesn't have collective efficacy, when you have an area that is socially deprived, this is what we see what's going on. To Rev points, when we have things like focused deterrence and cure violence and violence interruption, those things are great. Those programs have been evidence-based. They have shown effects, but it's not going to be enough. And if we're going to be serious about this thing, we have to focus on prevention. I think now the cause is because we've been so interested in the deterrence, people don't really know where to start with prevention. And so in 2016, a group of researchers, we got together at Temple University and we began to think about what it would look like to produce healthy outcomes for Black children. And we created something called the Urban Youth Leadership Academy. And what we did was we worked with individuals in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, because what we found out is that we had these individuals who were going to middle school, and we were finding that the middle school they went to determined the outcome of their life. And you're saying that's probably deterministic. And what was happening was, in order to get into the special admit schools, the Mastermans, the Girls High, the Central, you have to take algebra and pass algebra in 8th grade. Well, here's a really big disparity. If you go to a traditional middle school, public middle school, they don't offer algebra in 8th grade. So there's already a litany of schools that you can't even apply to. And so when we were trying to figure out why is the high school dropout rate so high, why people are not going into college and career, this is one of the areas of prevention, along with another areas of prevention we have to. So we have to get together, and that's not just researchers, that's community people, that's your mom, that's your auntie, that's high-level officials sitting together and saying, as we plan out this longitudinal model, how do we begin to prevent people from entering to the criminal justice system? And so I believe, as a criminologist, if there's something called the school-to-prison pipeline, then the inverse is true, and we can build pipelines towards success.
I got to leave it there, Juwan. That was a great way to end it. Juwan Z. Bennett, Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at Temple University, the Reverend Gregory Holston, Special Advisor on Policy and Advocacy at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and Movita Johnson-Harrell, founder of the Charles Foundation. Thank you so much for joining me for this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Neighbors in the Crossfire. We want to hear from you. Email us at talkback@whyy.org. Join us at the same time next week as we look at the code of the streets. For WHYY, I'm Chris Norris. Good night.
Everybody stop shooting. 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 Shooting. Everybody stop shooting. Shooting. Everybody stop shooting. Shooting. Everybody stop shooting. Shooting. Everybody stop shooting.